If your Bible's translation of Isaiah 7:14 says a virgin will conceive, that's a flagrant mistranslation that is just using the Septuagint as an excuse to make this passage sound a lot more like what it says in Matthew 1:23.
Dan McClellan is the king of biblical scholarship on TikTok. He's trying to make the world of biblical scholarship accessible to the general public. And for that, he received the Society of Biblical Literature's 2023 Richards Award for Public Scholarship. We also happened to be in a running group that year at the Society's annual meeting. So I got to know him a little bit running around San Antonio at 6 in the morning. As scholars, we're all trying to figure out what the text says. And we're trying our best to check our biases and presuppositions at the door. But we don't always agree on everything. Dan's work is highly important and influential. But with his permission, I want to offer an alternative perspective on a recent video he did on Isaiah 7:14. First, when is the virgin pregnant?
The Hebrew of Isaiah 7:14 is not very difficult. It says in Alma, a young woman is pregnant, so already has conceived. And she will give birth to a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Several centuries later, when this was translated into ancient Greek for the Septuagint, probably around the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, it didn't have any more relevance. This sign was about something that happened many centuries before. This may be why there are some changes made to the passage in the Greek. In the Greek, it says a young woman will become pregnant or will conceive. So it's putting it off into the future, making it sound more like an actual prophecy.
Dan is correct to point out that the verb form in the Hebrew of Isaiah 7:14 normally refers to the present time. And if I were to say the young woman is pregnant in biblical Hebrew, I would say it exactly as we have it in the verse. However, this does not mean that this is the only interpretation or even the best one. In English, we can talk about future events with the present tense, particularly when they are scheduled. We can say something like, the Celtics are playing the Knicks tomorrow night, for all you basketball fans out there. The verb are playing is in the present tense and is normally, but not always, interpreted in the present. The fact that we can use the adverb tomorrow with the present progressive, like are playing, shows that the present in English can be interpreted to refer to future events, even if it is normally used to talk about present events. This verb form in Hebrew behaves pretty much identically to the progressive be plus ing form in English. So if this verb form in Hebrew is talking about something predicted or scheduled, we might expect it also to refer to future events, just like the English present progressive. Since this is a prophecy, it is talking about something predicted. In fact, there is an essentially identical parallel in Judges 13:5, where the same exact verb form is used to refer to Manoah's wife becoming pregnant and giving birth to Samson at a later time. 2 verses earlier, the future verb form is used, so the verb in the present in Judges 13:5 has to refer to a future event. The Greek Septuagint translates both as future, just like in Isaiah 7:14. Finally, the verb is giving birth in Isaiah 7:14 is the same form as is pregnant in the Hebrew. But we are not to understand this as the young woman currently giving birth. Both are predicted future events, so both should be understood as future, just like in Judges 13:5, and just like the Septuagint translators understood the passage and rendered their translation into Greek with futures. Dan's second issue is about who is calling the promised child, which Matthew takes to be Jesus, Emmanuel.
But then instead of saying she will call his name Emmanuel, it says you will call his name Emmanuel, apparently talking about the king. So this puts it off into the future and makes it sound more prophetic. Now, when it's picked up by the author of Matthew, it is reread as a prophecy about the virgin birth of Jesus. Matthew makes another change. Instead of saying you will call his name Emmanuel, Matthew says they will call his name Emmanuel.
He says that the Septuagint changes the verb to you will call his name Emmanuel, rather than she will call his name Emmanuel. The verb form in Hebrew is the typical form for you spoken to a female, so the Septuagint is certainly not mistranslating it when it translates it as you. They are actually just translating it in a very straightforward way. But then why would Bible translations like the NIV say she will call his name Emmanuel? Since the young woman was already referred to in the third person in the verse, it is odd for the speaker to then address her. Saying she will give birth and she will name him is far more natural. This has led some scholars to suggest that the Hebrew form here is actually an archaic form of she, which is equivalent to the normal form for you. Yes, it's a little bit complicated. And indeed, we actually know from a language like Akkadian that this would have been the archaic form. We even see this archaic she form for a similar verb in a passage like Deuteronomy 31:29. And that's why most English translations say she will call his name Emmanuel. But Dan is right to point out that Matthew 1:23 doesn't say this. It says that they will call his name Emmanuel. And this is where it gets even more complicated. So is Matthew just changing the text here? It is certainly true that New Testament writers sometimes alter the text of the Old Testament when they quote it. For example, Paul changes Habakkuk 2:4 slightly when he cites it in Romans 1:17, which you can check out in another video of mine. But I don't think that is what is happening here. The oldest manuscripts of Isaiah 7:14 that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the oldest manuscripts of Isaiah 7:14 that we have, period, actually don't say you will call his name Emmanuel or she will call his name Emmanuel, the two options for the standard Hebrew text. But it clearly and unambiguously uses the form for he will call his name Emmanuel. In fact, Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the earliest manuscripts of the Septuagint, says the same thing, as does the Peshitta, the translation of the Old Testament into Syriac. But you might ask, why is this relevant? Matthew has they. Indeed, but the third person form he is often used in biblical Hebrew for impersonal constructions, similar to how we use you in English, like in you can see the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives. This isn't talking about a specific person. It is talking about anyone who happens to be standing on the Mount of Olives. They can see the Mount of Olives. Notice the impersonal third person plural they in that sentence. In other words, impersonal constructions refer to a plurality of people. So if Matthew's version of Isaiah 7:14 says, he will call his name Emmanuel, this could be an instance of impersonal he from biblical Hebrew, and this is actually the best interpretation of it. The only other option would be for he to refer to the baby who was just born. But babies normally don't name themselves, so the he is probably impersonal here. Since an impersonal is similar to a plural in that neither refers to a specific person, Matthew may have just been expressing the impersonal subject as a plural in Greek, just like I just expressed the impersonal you as a plural in English. Scholars and translators of the Bible are not neutral. That seems to be the underlying argument of Dan McClellan's recent video on the Hebrew of Isaiah 7:14. Basically, his argument is that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, and Matthew both change the Hebrew text of Isaiah 7:14. Some modern translations have then translated the Hebrew of Isaiah 7:14 to agree with the changes made by the Septuagint or Matthew, so that it looks more like a Christian prophecy. Dan is correct that we scholars are not neutral, and I wholeheartedly agree and affirm him in that. But ancient interpreters and translators should be given their due. There is often a reason for what we see in the text, and there is almost always more to a translation than what meets the eye.